I hope some of you have had a chance to look at the book, perhaps even read the introduction and chapter 1, which is what we're going to cover today. But just on the off chance that someone didn't get the book yet, I plan to give a little bit of a review of what it was about before we split you up into smaller groups to kind of share your own thoughts about that. So that's kind of how each week will go. We'll do a little group sharing about what the chapter was about, and then give you plenty of time, I hope, in weeks to come, maybe more than today, to talk with each other and share what this book is speaking to you about. But for right now, I would like to play a song. I hope I'll be able to get it loud enough for everyone to hear it. It always helps when you bring your iPad that you first charge your iPad. Something I tend to forget about. So we're going to try to hear it from my phone. It is Nobody Knows the Trouble I See. And if you read the book, you know that Dr. Cohn uses this several times in the first chapter and the introduction to speak to the experience of the Black person in the South and the North, particularly during those years of lynching, which were horrible. Here we go, maybe. I got you, get it. That was Paul Robeson singing that. I won't ever hear that the same way I used to after having read this book. So I just want to give you a little synopsis, and I will be brief, but if you have thoughts or questions that you think I missed if you read it, or you don't understand something that we've said, please feel free to chime in and ask a question or make a comment, because I don't want this to be a one-way thing. Yes? Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. And that was Paul Robeson. There are many who have sung it, but that one to me is the richest because that voice just speaks volumes by itself. Okay, so this book is really about the way in which two separate by 2,000 years events are interconnected. The torture and death of Jesus Christ on the cross and the torture and death of Black people in this country from lynching. When you think about it, it's kind of obvious that there's a connection, I think. Both are forms of punishment and execution that are outside the law. Both are spectacles. Both are devices that were used by the dominating power to enforce its grip on the powerless. Both are sadistic. Both add shame to the pain as a way to heighten terror. And both suspend the victim in a way that others can see. People could come and watch. We know they came and watched when Jesus was on the cross, and we know that people gathered in droves to witness lynchings. But how did white Christians miss the connection? That's one of the questions that Dr. Cohn poses. Did they miss it? Or did they just choose to ignore it? He says whites want to forget about it, pretend it didn't happen, and Blacks stuff it in somewhere until it erupts. Slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, all incompatible with Christianity, and yet all part of what Christians did to other Christians. The cross became so central to Black Christians in our country because it was a sign of hope. It was a sign of dignity. It was a sign of mattering. It was a sign of their humanity that is shared by all of us, even though, they were being told that that was not the case. They were perhaps less than human. Both the cross and the lynching tree represent a thirst for an assurance that humanity's worst need not determine our destiny or the final judgment on human life. Lynching grew out of the shaming of the South, which was defeated by the North. And then when the North pulled out of the South after Reconstruction, it left a vacuum. And into that vacuum came white supremacy. And the white supremacists were absolutely determined that no power, no life, no interaction, no interconnectedness would ever happen between the races. The book talks about the birth of a nation and the power that that movie had, both in the South and the North, and it seemed to kind of raise up lynching as a good thing, something to be celebrated. It was, of course, terror. When we think about the war on terror, that should be our war now, on that terror, because it was awful. There is a man, I guess he was real, named Judge Lynch. He talks about him being a judge during the Revolutionary War because lynching didn't start in 1860. It started before that, where Tories, sympathizers to the English, could be lynched and punished in that way. But as communities moved westward, this Judge Lynch attitude of getting rid of people that you thought were a problem through lynching went with them. And so lynching, Judge Lynch, we get the name lynching. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, but Bishop Lynch High School used to have as their motto being the lynch mob. That's what they call themselves, the lynch mob. I don't think they realized, but that's because we're so ignorant, right? But they did change it, and it is no longer their motto. It changed since I got to Texas, which was in 1990. So sometime in the late 90s or the early 2000s, they recognized that that no longer could be their motto. But just interesting how close to our time we're still so unaware of what this still means to people of color. It's not just a historical event of the past. It still means something today, something very important. Most of the lynching was between 1880 and 1940. And to combat it, or to try to survive it, Cone talks about two things that Black people did. One was the juke joint, where they would go on a Friday or a Saturday night and dance and celebrate and sing and have a good time and celebrate one another and celebrate life and sing spirituals, right? And the blues. Blues were in the juke joints, the spirituals were in the church. So those were the two places, and those were the two avenues. The juke joints and the church, the blues and the spirituals, which gave expression to their humanity and told a different story than the one that we're hearing from the whites. A couple of quotes I'll read you and then I'm done. But one could correctly say that the spirituals and the church, with Jesus' cross at the heart of its faith, gave birth to the Black freedom movement that reached its peak in the civil rights era during the 1950s and 60s. That's one quote from the book. Another, when people do not want to be themselves but somebody else, that is utter despair. I thought that was a very powerful sentence. When people do not want to be themselves, who God made them to be, but someone else, that is utter despair. And lastly, Jesus achieved salvation for the least through his solidarity with them, even unto death. So it was the power of their faith that helped Black people to endure this horrendous time and continues, I think, to do that. Questions, comments, something you read that I missed in this brief synopsis?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, it was called Lynch because that was the name of a bishop of Dallas.
That's Bishop.
It didn't come in, and the goodness that they saw in him kind of silenced their sense of history.
Anyone else? You remember the juke joints? Oh, Maggie was sneaking around under the tent when there was a revival in her town. Yes, a lifeline. Run home before you got caught. Yes, yes. So Maggie said that they would sneak in and listen to the music and the hallelujahs and all the celebration and then get out quickly and go home before they got caught. Yes. Barbara said that the image of African Americans changed with the end of the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, African Americans were seen as submissive, docile, and then after the Civil War, that changed and they were more to be feared, seen as aggressive, sexually aggressive, women as kind of Jezebels, as the book says. And so that difference is striking, as people had more fear, I guess, of a free African American than one that they could control in slavery. So they found other ways to control. Yeah. Did you want to say something, Rebecca?
Well, and the language that they
Mhm.
I wonder. All of them.
I want to give you plenty, well, as much time as we can. I won't say plenty to talk. So we have a few questions that come from a couple of studies. You don't have to stay with these. Talk about whatever is in your hearts and minds to talk about. But if you would get in groups, just your own choosing of maybe 4 or 5, maybe be with people you don't know so you can get to know some new people, or whatever you want to do. You're grown-ups. I'll let you choose. And that's what we'll do for the rest of our time. We'll be to just kind of share in small groups. If you do not.
Hey, Allison, is there a we can share without interrupting what's happening on site?
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I'm.
Maybe
Yeah.
group.
Oh,
Oh,
looks
there
like
you go.
questions. Okay.
There you go.
All right, friends, I'm going to move over to a corner and we'll try to have a group together. How does that sound?
Okay.
And it could be a little hard to hear when so many people are talking in here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you can hear one another. I don't think you have the benefit of the handout. So let me read to you some of the questions that are here for conversation, and then we can go in any direction we want, as Pastor Nancy said. Oh dear, there are Roman numerals on this. On page 14 of the introduction, that's XIV, Dr. Cohn states, unfortunately, during the course of 2,000 years of Christian history, this symbol of salvation, meaning the cross, has been detached from any reference to the oppression of human beings. So the cross has been detached from reference to oppression, its use as a tool of oppression. Do you agree? I can pause there and we can have some reflection.
In doing the reading, I was reminded of a YouTube that I watched. And it was a bunch of Black psychoanalysts in New York City that were doing a panel. And there was a woman, she looked like she was probably 60. And she said that she had psychoanalyzed Holocaust survivors and Blacks, American Blacks. And she said that the level of oppression that each had endured over their lifetime. It was more compressed in the case of the Holocaust survivor. But the level of oppression that she had to treat in these two groups was identical. And that blew my mind out of the water. But reading this book, I was like, oh, yeah. You know, if you witnessed people of your race being lynched for nothing, if your father was forced to take his hat off and bow his head, if whites came up on their horse, if you were constantly exposed to that level of humiliation, then yeah, I can see where she's coming from.
Yeah, not to bring in other works. I don't know if any of you read My Grandmother's Hands. It's an excellent book. I'm trying to remember the name of the author and it's gone right out of my head, but he deals in trauma and in the way trauma is passed down from generation to generation in our bodies and in our emotional health. And he talks about the cross and the lynching tree, and also about the public brutality of minorities in the homeland, in Europe, around all over Europe, that happened, that gave rise to lynching here, as things that have passed down this systemic sense of oppression in certain groups of people. And his thought is that somehow even those mass public killings, even back before white people came to the United States, somehow that there was no connection to those public hangings and things like that, and back to the cross either. That, in other words, I guess what I'm not saying very well is that we tend to see a public hanging or a lynching as an act of violence against a particular individual, not as an act of systemic oppression.
Oh.
And I think in the church, we have seen that as well, that the theology that we make of the death of Christ on the cross is all about he was killed for our salvation. He was brutalized for our healing. And we don't then remember to think about how many others were crucified in that day and how that method of death was used as a means of cultural oppression, of genocide against anyone who would resist the empire. I don't know. What do you think?
It seems like that too, that oppression, it's like an erasure of someone's humanity. It's like they're less than. It's like that's what we're talking about. And it's one of the things that I heard, I guess it's now a year and a half ago or so, is a woman speaking on how she, in her writings, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who she is, would say, you know, I refer to people who were enslaved as enslaved people, not as slaves. And since that time, I've thought about that so much, because slaves sort of seems like a word that means that that's who they are, less than.
Mm-hmm.
And so whenever I say enslaved people, unfortunately, I think about that person in a different way. It just shows you what words can do, and words can kind of enforce some kind of less than, somebody's taking away somebody's humanity, and we get used to it. And then when we look at it in a different way, we can maybe see their suffering better and their oppression better. So I think this whole conversation about the cross as looking at oppression of people is really important. because we do just think about it in terms of Jesus Christ and not in terms of other people we've oppressed. Yeah.
Mm. Mhm.
You're building on what Rebecca and your name says Nancy, but you look like Rebecca. Rebecca, and you said, Allison, I think sometimes when we're suffering, we focus too much on our suffering and we put back away our empathy and compassion for others who are suffering.
Mm.
For example, in Ukraine right now, a Christian nation, okay, as you know, let me see here. On Tuesday, the New York Times reported that Africans who had been living in Ukraine say they have been stuck for days, held up, and sometimes beaten by Ukrainian authorities who are letting Ukrainians across regularly. On Wednesday, a USA Today headline read, "Black and brown refugees are once again being turned away in Europe amid Ukraine migrant crisis." Now, that's a form of lynching, no matter how you look at it. And so, when today, the temptations of Christ, I think we have to imagine, how do we lynch people? Not on trees, but do we ourselves in ways lynch people we disagree with? Of people who do things that we think are horrible. Oh, I would never do that. But in reality, I think we need to enter our own selves and ask, what are the ways on this Sunday, especially with that gospel, are we tempted to lynch people?
Mm. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to keep us moving through these questions just so we get a sense for where we're going in reflection. Before picking up this book, or if you haven't been able to pick it up before hearing the introduction today, did it ever occur to you, just in your own reflection on race relations in our country or otherwise, that there is a link between the cross and the lynching tree? Is that a connection that you'd ever thought of on your own or heard made in cultural references?
The only time I heard anything about that was years ago at another church, when on Palm Sunday, a Black preacher came to our predominantly white church and talked about how Jesus was the victim and Jesus was murdered. And I had never heard anyone put it in the way he did, because he also added his perspective on it. I still didn't, even at that time, understand a link between the crucifixion and lynching, though, in spite of the fact that he was saying talking about Jesus being murdered. I still didn't make that connection.
I agree. I had never made the connection either, because I think I just looked at the words lynching in a very narrow, specific way. And so with this whole discussion and the book and all of this, it made me open up my mind that lynching has many forms. And so I never did make the connection. So until now.
I think both of those comments are helpful. Susan, I want to come back to you in a moment, but just to say, I think after journeying through this text together in Lent, we will all arrive at Good Friday and hear that reading, hear Palm Sunday and Good Friday readings in a very different way.
For me, the George Floyd thing and the other police murders, I finally linked those to lynching. I didn't link them to the cross. Okay, but those are lynchings.
Yeah. Yes, and those are the very worst kind, right? Like state-conducted lynching.
State sanctioned in many cases. The man who shot 3 bullets through the apartment wall of Breonna Taylor was exonerated for endangering the people in the next apartment.
So many are. So many are. Have you heard Nina Simone's song, Strange Fruit?
Oh, yeah.
There's a connection there. Be a good one to go back and listen to this week
Yeah.
deeply. Do you think most white Americans would prefer to forget this period of our history? I'm not even sure that's a question. I mean, right?
I think there's no acknowledgement about how it's affected people now. I think
Mhm.
that's it. And I think I would be one of those who would have said this is in the past, but it isn't, because all of the, the repercussions from it are still present. And as we were just talking about, Ahmaud Arbery was lynched. And so I think we want to think that it's not affecting our lives anymore. It never affected our lives anyway. It affected lives of Black people.
I want to pause you there and say, I'm not sure that's true. I've remembered the first name of the author of My Grandmother's Hands. It's Rezma, R-E-Z-M-A. He says, yes, absolutely, this happened to Black and brown bodies, people with Black and brown bodies. But imagine yourself as a young girl, or guys as a young boy, white, in the Jim Crow era, standing around at the youngest age you can imagine yourself, watching a lynching. And this is part of what he does. He does a lot of trauma work. And so he'll have people actually meditate to become quiet and then put themselves there. Imagine what is going through your mind as that's happening. At the youngest age you can imagine, the first time you've ever seen it happening. Are you not afraid? Are you not traumatized by what you're seeing? Do you not, as a white body, the first time you see that happen, fear that something like that can and will happen to you? And that trauma sticks down into our souls, our psyches, our bodies, and it never goes away. Even after we get a little older and somebody says, well, it's because that's a Black person and because they did this thing. What we do is partition the trauma that we felt at seeing it, experiencing it, and seclude it away and say, well, that's not me. But that doesn't mean it's not there. And so he actually believes that white bodies have suffered trauma as a result of this part of our nation's history as well, that we'd like to forget and we'd like to think doesn't affect us, but does. And if you think a little about our impotence in how do we even begin to address issues between the races, I think it has affected us. I don't know.
When I was reading the introduction in the chapter again, I was struck by, as a psychiatrist, the first criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder is witnessing a death or being in danger of death. And so, yes, I mean, I hear what you just said, but what I was more relating to was the PTSD of every Black person.
Yes.
In a lynching town.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm opening my mind to what you're saying, because it really meets the criteria. Witnessing a death,
Mm-hmm. Mm.
the threat of a death, it changes you forever. It's in there. And, and sometimes we protect ourselves by suppressing that so that we can go forward. And, that can be a good thing, to not stop and get stuck. But yes, you just blew my mind open.
Well, that's resma, right? Like that's, and I read that and it stuck with me for a long time. And I think it's important as white people that we do not come away from that realization and feel like we need care for that trauma. We need to care for our own selves and deal with our own trauma. But I mean, as I was listening to you, Susan, witnessing a death, and I was thinking, what if you witness a death that's caused by your father who's dressed in white and wearing a hood,
Yeah.
right?
And what do you
And how
have
long
to
does
do?
it take before
What
you
do you
realize
have
you're
to do?
expected? Hmm?
What do you have to do to that memory to be
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
This is your father. You want to survive. You just saw him kill somebody.
Yes.
What do? You forget.
And are you allowed to forget because he fully expects you will grow into a man who will do this too? If you're a
That
boy.
too. That too.
So how did that trauma affect the adults who were lynching blacks, the white adults? I don't know if we know that. I don't know if that's been written about. I mean,
There's a book in the pile next to me that if it falls over on me, a book's to be read that it'll kill me. But Wendell Berry book, the white wound, something like that. And I bet that's what it's talking about. I can't swear it, but hello.
Y'all, I need to move toward worship at 11:15. I'm going to leave you with the last question and let you all continue to talk about it. We've covered the last one. What are some examples of modern day lynchings? So the final question for us today is, what is the cross symbolized in your life? And why do you think this is one of the famous things that James Cone is known for saying? Why is it that we have transformed the cross into a harmless, non-offensive ornament that Christians wear around their necks? This symbol of murder and corporal punishment now adorns our bodies and our walls and all over. So I'm going to let you all continue to talk. And that's kind of where that last question is taking you in our conversation. Thank you for letting me be a part of your group today. I'll see you later.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah,
I
I'd
was
like to
thinking that-
interject a thought that Pope Francis has addressed that directly, that the cross should never be worn as an ornament, as a piece of jewelry. Don't wear it unless you know what it means and what it expresses. So I think, yes, I think many have reduced, I would say perhaps members of my family, even myself, that the cross, don't think about it when I put it on sometimes. But to just add one last thing, I'm a Franciscan, and the cross was the center of St. Francis of Assisi's life. He found joy. It also the robe the Franciscan wear, he designed so that it was a cross at the top.
Can I just stop you for 1 second? I'm gonna go, when you're done, just exit the meeting, okay? All right.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I just like to begin with those thoughts. So yes, I do agree with what Rebecca was saying. It's
I agree with what
we can deaden ourselves to its meaning.
I agree with what Ed just said. There's a very dear Episcopal priest, the late Ted Nelson, who was very, very dear to my heart. And for a couple of years, I was wearing this beautiful crucifix. And one day he came up to me and he said, "We're resurrection Christians. You should be wearing, a cute little cross." And I said, "Hey, Teddy," I said, "this is how most Christians feel most days." That's why I wear it. But I mean, for me, it's always been a crucifix. It's not been a flat little cross. Even if I'm wearing a flat little cross, it's a crucifix. And it's it's the murder of Jesus, the suffering of Jesus, the willing suffering of Jesus for me. It's not it's never, ever an ornament.
Mhm. In some of my readings, also by Franciscans, we were challenged at liturgy. How do you see officiants, celebrants, and how do you see them, yourself and them, signing yourselves? Is there any real thought that this is a prayer identifying the cross in your own life? It's a very, very challenge. And I watch liturgies online, and the way people say, bust their self. So how do we use the sign of the cross? Do we use it as a meaningless motion, not thinking about it? Or every time we use it, do we understand what we're doing?
Yeah, that's a good point, Ed. It makes me trying to connect that to the crucifix. I have a very distant memory of picking up a small crucifix, and I remember not knowing anything about it because we didn't go to church when I was younger. We went to the Unitarian church sometimes, and I don't even remember where this was. I just remember picking that up, and it was small, and I didn't know. So I think the crucifix can help us tell the story to people who don't know. Fortunately, there wasn't anybody around who could tell me. I just put it down from wherever it was. I don't know. So I think it has a place to tell us, but we have to tell the whole story, right? Like you're bringing up, Ed, we have to think about that when we do the sign of the cross to what we're actually doing.
When I was pastor of a church in New Jersey, very wealthy area of New Jersey, I had to reprimand my director of religious education because she insisted on taking the crucifix out of every classroom and just putting a cross there. So again, it feeds into what Rebecca was saying. I mean, I really think maybe we have lost its true meaning. Maybe. I mean, that you'd want to take it out of the classroom because it was offensive. It might harmful to kids. Well, as you say early on, maybe that's a way of exposing them to the horror of the injustices that we're talking about. But no, we just needed the resurrection, either the resurrection Christ or nothing.
Well, I think we need both. I think we need both.
Yeah.
But
well, no, we do. We do.
But you know, all of us on this call are in the racial justice ministry, and it strikes me that we can expand the sign of the cross and expand it to connect us with those that are suffering, with the Blacks who are suffering every day. Black children. Somebody did a study in a psychiatric presentation that I listened to. They went into the schools and they just sat in the corner and they monitored the microaggressions. And Black kids are getting 5 microaggressions every day. So every Black is getting at least 5, okay? But the Blacks, the victims of police brutality, the Ukrainians, that when we make the sign of the cross, we can join our hearts and our prayer with all who are suffering. And not just Christians. Hello, you know, there's weird wars happening other places, but I mean, at least as Americans and at least as people whose hearts are going out to the Ukraine, we can join in.
Yeah.
I had a friend I used to have coffee with once in a while. He talked me into coming to a Wednesday night study at an Episcopal church, is eventually where I met Allison. I remember asking him, why are some crosses showing Jesus hanging there and some are bare? His explanation is that Jesus overcame death, and that's why there's just a cross now. And it's for is taking away our sins and giving us hope for eternal life. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Well, that's true. That's absolutely true. But it strikes me that maybe we need to look at crucifixes so that we all get a little dose of PTSD, so that we all get that ability to empathize with those who are being lynched in some way, whether it's dead lynched or humiliated lynched or less than human lynched. That maybe the crucifix can bring us both of those things. Those are both, I mean, it's all true. It's not one thing.
Does anybody else feel that part of our temptation is to reject the cross as part of our life? Remember Jesus' words to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." And Jesus said he would suffer and die. And that also contributes, perhaps, a small factor, maybe, but contributes to our whole approach to this idea of lynching in the broader sense, not simply on a tree, that we should open our eyes to see the lynchings that are going on around us and open our ears to our own tongue when things we say are lynching other people in some way. I think that's possible. And I think that's, to me, has been enlightenment in our current political situation. How we want to demonize and lynch those who we judge have done severe evils, injustice evils, perhaps rather than lynch them, ask that they be healed in some way. Because the healing of this situation is what's going to make it better, if you can use that word, and not the name calling that's going on. We have a sign here of a local Republican. I used to be a Republican, by the way, when I was in New York, but changed since I come to Texas. So hear me. There are signs all over. Van Tyler betrayed us. Don't vote for him. And then they dug into his life and saw that he had an extramarital affair. And they hung him with that he had to withdraw from the race.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a form, if you're using our imagination, of lynching? It's not just on trees. It's happening all around us, and it's sad, I guess. If you want to win an election, lynch your opponent with the evils of his life. That seems to be where we're at. And maybe I'm stretching here, but I think it's, I need to consider it. I think we all do.
Yeah.
Well, Ed, you've heard this already, but Allison hasn't heard it. Last week, I did something that I've done before, but last week I fasted to repent of Vladimir Putin's sin. And I don't know what happened to him, but what happened to me is that I changed and I saw him as my brother in Christ. And it made it easier for me to pray blessings on him. It gave me a soft heart instead of a heart of stone. And I'm pretty sure that soft hearts, prayers that are prayed with soft hearts, are more powerful. Can't prove it to you, but hello. And when I was reading for this lesson, I felt called that I'm going to fast and pray for Donald Trump. And another day I'm going to fast and pray for Mitch McConnell. And there may be others that come. But those are the ones I feel a calling for. But it changes it changes me. It changes me. And if I can just quickly say something, and then I have to rush off because I'm serving lunch to my daughter and her husband. During the first Gulf War, I felt an extremely strong calling to pray to repent of, fast and repent of Saddam Hussein's sin. And I learned this from the wife of an Episcopal priest, Agnes Sanford, who brought the healing ministry back to the Christian church. And so what Agnes used to say is, if you pray for world things, look in the newspaper the next day. And what happened was, I did that on a Wednesday, and when I picked up the paper Friday, what I read in the paper is that Saddam Hussein had gone before his parliament on Thursday. They're halfway around the world, so it's, and he had gone before his parliament, and he'd asked God's forgiveness for his sins against the hostages. He had 540 hostages. And he said, this was the early first week in December, and he said, most of them are Christian, and I'm going to have them home for Christmas. Have the clipping of that. So, but what happened to me, what I did last week, is that I changed. And I changed before that happened too. I changed in my attitude toward him. So, but I have to go because I have to cook for my daughter. So
Thank you for sharing that. That's helpful to me.
Thanks, Suzanne. Nancy, we've been having a great discussion here.
That's
We
good.
could probably stay on and have lunch together.
Well, there you go. I'm sure I'll hear all about it when I get home.
No, it's a
I
Zoom
want to, you
call.
better.
Now it's a Zoom call. It's private.
Oh, no. I've been on it, so I'm included. Have a great day, Thompsons.
All right.
We'll
Thanks.
see ya.
Thank you so much again.
Bye.
Really, really valuable.
That was good.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.